Everything you think you know about cowboys is wrong. The real American cowboy was not a gunslinging hero on a white horse, and he never looked anything like John Wayne. Picture instead a young, underpaid, sleep-deprived laborer pulling 18-hour days caked in weeks of dried sweat, unable to swim, and living in genuine fear of his own cattle. $30 a month covered his wages, which even by 1870s standards bought almost nothing. And the entire cowboy era, this thing we've built an entire national identity around, lasted barely 25 years, which gives it a shorter run than The Simpsons. This video covers what your life would actually look like if you worked as a cowboy in the 1800s, and it's going to make your 9-to-5 feel like a luxury resort. Getting the job. The Civil War just ended, and the year is 1866. You're somewhere in Texas, probably between 16 and 25 years old, and nobody is hiring for much of anything. What Texas does have is cattle. Somewhere between 3 and 6 million head roaming free with no market and no buyers. A longhorn steer sells for $2 to $5 locally, but up north, where the Union Army consumed the entire beef supply during the war, that same animal fetches $25 to $40, and some buyers pay up to $60. That gap between $2 and $60 launched an entire industry. And you, whether you know it yet or not, are about to become a cowboy. The word cowboy carries some baggage worth knowing about. During the American Revolution, it described pro-British cattle thieves, so not exactly a compliment. So before the Civil War in Texas, white workers earned the title cowhands, while black workers doing the identical job got labeled cowboys, and the term was meant as a slur. The whole thing only became cool after the war, which counts as one of the better rebrands in the English language. You walk up to a ranch, and if the trail boss decides you look capable, you're in at $25 to $40 a month, plus meals and a place to sleep. Nothing else comes included. And this is where the math turns ugly. A working saddle costs $30 to $60, meaning 1 to 2 full months of your salary disappears into a single piece of leather and wood. Horses run $150 to $200, which eats 5 to 7 months of wages. A Colt point, 45 Peacemaker sets you back 17. A Winchester rifle, 40. A boots land between $375 and $15. And a Satsang hat runs $3 to $5. Add it all up, and your basic outfit totals somewhere between $72 and $111. Nearly 4 months of pay gone before you've worked a single day. The saving grace here is that most cowboys never buy their own horse. Ranchers maintain a remuda, a herd of spare mounts, and each rider rotates through 8 to 10 horses during the day. Your saddle, on the other hand, belongs to you and you alone. Cowboys treated that saddle the way most people treat a house, because it cost about the same relative to their income. To understand how tight the money was, consider what things cost in the 1870s. Restaurant dinner ran $15 to $25. A haircut and bath together cost a quarter, while hotel rooms went for $1 to $2 a night, and a jug of whiskey ran about the same. Your entire monthly paycheck equaled roughly 15 restaurant meals or 20 baths, which explains exactly why cowboys blew through every cent the moment they reached town. Retirement planning was not part of the culture. The trails that made it possible before we get into daily life. The trails themselves need some explaining because there were no roads out here. Cattle moved along named routes that sound like they belong in Western novels, and several of them ended up in Western novels. The Shawnee Trail came first, running from San Antonio north through Austin, Waco, and Dallas into Missouri from the 1840s through about 1873. Missouri farmers killed it by blocking herds at the border since Texas cattle carried a tick-borne disease called Texas fever that wiped out northern livestock. That trail never recovered. The famous one, the Chisholm Trail, takes its name from Jesse Chisholm, a Scottish Cherokee trader who blazed a wagon route through Indian Territory around 1864. Chisholm himself never drove a single cow on it, which remains one of the better pieces of Western trivia. 800 miles stretched between San Antonio and the Kansas railheads, passing through Fort Worth and across the Red River. And somewhere between 5 and 6 million cattle walked that distance over 2 decades. 6 million animals on foot, one direction, which makes modern freeway traffic look almost reasonable. Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving established their trail in 1866, and they deliberately made it almost comically long. Rather than cutting straight north through Comanche and Kaya territory, the route swung southwest across 90 meters of waterless desert on the Llano Estacado before reaching Fort Sen, New Mexico. The U.S. Army stationed there needed beef to feed 8,000 Navajo prisoners held at Bosque Rundo, which means the government's need to feed people it had imprisoned created the market that launched the trail. History folds in on itself like that sometimes. Oliver Loving's death on that trail deserves its own moment. Comanches fatally wounded him in the summer of 1867 while he scouted ahead, and though he survived long enough to reach Fort Snar, gangrene took him on September 25th. What happened next tells you everything about cowboy loyalty. His men built a casket from tin oil cans, hauled his body hundreds of miles back down the trail, and buried him in Weatherford, Texas, on March 4, 1868. Larry McMurray later built Lonesome Dove around Loving's story. And the fact that a Pulitzer novelist couldn't improve much on the real version says enough. These trails cut through Comanche, Kaya, Cherokee, Creek, and Seol territories, and the tribes had every reason to object. Cattle drives trampled farmland, herds carried disease, and the buffalo these nations depended on had been systematically wiped out, while government rations amounted to a reported $3 per person per year. Tribes responded by charging tolls, usually a few head of cattle per herd passing through. Quanah Parker of the Comanche collected those tolls and sold grazing rights so effectively that he built up a 100 horses, 1,000 cattle, and 250 acres. Goodnight negotiated directly with Parker, agreeing to provide bison meat every other day in exchange for the Comanche leaving the J.A. Ranch alone, and the arrangement held. John T. Little blazed the Western Trail in 1874 with 3,500 longhorns, and it grew into the main cattle highway after 1875. Total volume may have exceeded even the Chisholm Trail with an estimated 5 to 6 million head. And the peak year of 1881 saw over 301,000 cattle pass a single checkpoint called Dunn's Crossing on the Red River. All of these trails fed into a handful of Kansas cattle towns that boomed and collapsed on almost comical timelines. Joseph McCoy built Abilene stockyards in 1867, and 4 years later, the citizens signed a petition begging the cattle trade to leave. Newton lasted a single season in 1871, packing 27 saloons and 8 gambling halls into a town that earned the nickname Wickedest City in the West. Wichita picked up from 1872 to 1876, and then Dodge City took the crown as Queen of the Cowtowns from 1876 to 1885, moving over 75,000 head a year at its height. Each town cycled through boom, chaos, civilization, and respectability in the time it takes most cities to finish a zoning dispute. A day on the trail, back to you now. A typical cattle drive pushes 2,000 to 3,000 head from South Texas to a Kansas railhead, covering roughly 800 to 1,000 miles over 2 to 5 months, depending on the weather, the route, and whether the rivers decide to cooperate. Your morning starts at 3:30 when the cook hollers roll out, and you peel yourself off the ground where you've been sleeping on a bedroll. Not a tent, not a cot, just the bare ground in whatever weather happened overnight. 5 to 6 hours of sleep counts as a good night. and that total gets carved up by night watch shifts, lasting 2 to 4 hours, where you ride slow circles around thousands of skittish cattle in the dark, singing to keep them calm. The singing matters enormously, and we'll get to why. 10 to 15 cowboys manage the whole herd under a strict chain of command. The trail boss runs everything. The segundo backs him up. Point riders steer the front, and swing riders handle the flanks. New hands draw drag duty at the very back of the herd, where 3,000 cattle kick up a wall of dust thick enough to coat a man's skin like fur. According to cowboys who rode there, that position amounts to inhaling Boyne particulate matter for 16 straight hours, which is the cowboy equivalent of being the office intern, except the coffee is made of dirt. Herds move 10 to 15 mirrors a day, and that pace is deliberate. Rushing cattle burns off their weight, and weight translates directly into money at the railhead. So, the trail boss keeps things agonizingly slow. You're crossing the Great Plains at a speed that would bore a tortoise. Charles Goodnight invented the chuck wagon in 1866 by converting a surplus Studebaker army wagon, adding a sloping chuck box at the rear with a hinged lid that folded into a worked, shelves and drawers inside, a water barrel mounted to the outside, and a canvas possum belly slung underneath for firewood and dried cow chips. Cow chips being dried cow dung because that's what fueled the cooking fire. Welcome to frontier dining. The cook doubled as the outfit's barber, banker, dentist, and doctor, pulling rotten teeth with pliers and offering whiskey as the only anesthesia available. Every night, the cook pointed the chuck wagon's tongue north so the trail boss could read direction at dawn, which made it a GPS built from wood and oxen. The food, what you eat on the trail, never changes, and that is not an exaggeration. Breakfast means bacon, beans, sourdough biscuits, and black coffee. Lunch means bacon, beans, sourdough, biscuits, and black coffee. Dinner, and you can already see where this lands, means bacon, beans, sourdough biscuits, and black coffee. The beans earned the nickname whistleberries among cowboys, and the reason behind that name should be self-explanatory. Occasionally, the cook might fry up steak, pot roast, stew, or short ribs, and on a truly special night, there could be peach cobbler or spotted pup, which was rice pudding with raisins baked in a Dutch oven. That counted as fine dining on the plains. Fresh fruit, vegetables, and eggs never appeared for months at a time, which meant you were running a daily marathon fueled by a diet that any modern nutritionist would describe as a cry for help. Prepare yourself for this part. Cowboys went weeks, and sometimes as months without bathing on the trail, wearing the same clothes every day, until those clothes practically fused to their bodies. Fungal infections spread freely. Lice infestations became so common that cowboys nicknamed the parasites seam squirrels, and skin diseases flourished in conditions that offered no soap, no clean water, and no privacy. Dental care consisted entirely of the cook, a barber, or a blacksmith yanking rotten teeth with pliers while the patient drank whiskey. That was the full benefits package. When a cattle drive finally reached town after months on the trail, cowboys spent their first money on a hot bath, a haircut, a shave, and clean clothes. And they did this before touching whiskey or visiting a saloon. A 20-year-old man choosing soap over alcohol after 3 months on horseback tells you everything about how severe the smell situation had become. Everything covered so far qualifies as brutal, but this section is where things turn genuinely dark. The leading killers on the cattle trail ranked roughly as drowning, stampedes, horse accidents, lightning, and disease. Gunfights barely registered, and we'll get into why that matters later. Drowning claimed more cowboys than almost anything else. And here's the part that seems impossible. Most of them could not swim. Your job requires crossing multiple rivers alongside thousands of cattle, and you never learned to keep yourself afloat. Of the Red River earned a reputation as a terror to trail drivers, and a cowboy named George Duffield recorded in his 1866 diary that a single crossing cost him 300 drowned cattle. His entries read like dispatches from a man losing his mind, cataloging stampedes, rain, and lost livestock, including one passage noting 200 bees out and nothing to eat. Multiple entries close with the same two words: everything discouraging. George Duffield was not enjoying his career. Stampedes terrified cowboys more than any other danger on the trail. A rattlesnake, a struck match, a horse shaking off flies, a rabbit bursting from a bush, or a crack of lightning could send thousands of longhorns running at full speed through pitch darkness, as your job at that point was to gallop alongside them and mill the herd into a circle until they stopped. During an 1879 stampede, John B. Kendrick recalled the only thing visible being electricity dancing on his horse's ears, while lightning crept along the ground beneath him, with cattle dropping dead 25 to 30 feet away. The cowboy ballad, Little Joe the Wrangler, tells the story of a young rider found beneath his horse, mashed to a pulp. And that lyric describes something that actually happened to real people. And this is exactly why cowboys sang through their night-watch shifts. It had nothing to do with romance. Cattle spooked at unfamiliar sounds, but so riders kept up a steady stream of familiar noise through hymns and ballads like Sam Bass, Bury Me Not on the Lone Prairie, and the old Chisholm Trail. One of the best cowboy songs, Old Paint, traces back to a black man named Charlie Willis, who learned it driving cattle up the trail in the 1870s and passed it along in 1884. Lightning created a particular horror on the open plains because a man on horseback became the tallest object for miles in any direction. St. Delmo's fire, which cowboys called foxfire, danced across cattle horns and horses' ears during storms. Joseph McCoy described the cowboy's position during a nighttime electrical storm as trying far more than romantic, with glowing balls jumping from tip to tip of the cattle's horns. Disease worked quietly in the background, killing through pneumonia, cholera, dysentery, typhoid, and smallpox, mostly caused by sleeping in the open and drinking contaminated water. One historian put it plainly: death for a cowboy more often arrived in the unromantic form of pneumonia. The injuries that fell short of killing you could still ruin your body permanently. Broken bones that healed without a doctor. Chronic saddle sores, wrecked backs, hernias, rattlesnake bites, frostbite, heat stroke, and hemorrhoids so severe from months in the saddle that cowboys dreaded them but refused to discuss them publicly. Some men rubbed tobacco juice directly into their own eyes to stay awake during night watch. And that sentence is not a metaphor. The people Hollywood forgot. The cowboy workforce looked nothing like anything you've seen in a Western film. And the gap between reality and Hollywood borders on deliberate erasure. 1/3 of all cowboys were non-white. Roughly 25% identified as black or African-American. 15 to 20% were Hispanic or Mexican-American. And Native Americans rode the trails as well, though no reliable count exists for their numbers. What really needs to be understood is that Mexican vaqueros invented the cowboy profession. Every technique, every piece of gear, and the majority of the vocabulary came straight from Spanish ranching traditions stretching back to the 1500s. Lasso, lariat, rodeo, chaps, bronco, corral, mustang, buckaroo, ranch, remuda, stampede. All of those words are Spanish. The American cowboy, it has a concept and a skill set, was a Mexican creation. Vaqueros earned less than 1/3 of white cowboys' wages, despite having originated the entire culture. That disparity says plenty on its own. Many black cowboys had learned livestock handling skills during slavery, and the post-war West offered something the South would not, an imperfect but real shot at something closer to equality. One museum curator explained the dynamic by pointing out that the land was so vast and conditions so harsh that racism sometimes took a backseat to survival, because prejudice gets difficult when everyone is hungry and thirsty. Black cowboys still drew the worst horses and caught extra duties like laundry and testing stream depth. But the trail offered more than most alternatives. Nat Love, born into slavery in Tennessee in 1854, but left home at age 15 and found work as a cowboy in Dodge City. He claimed victory in a roping and shooting competition at Deadwood, Dakota Territory, on July 4, 1876, picking up the nickname Deadwood Dick, though Deadwood newspapers from that day mention no such rodeo, which suggests either sloppy local record-keeping or some creative autobiography, and probably a bit of both. His 1907 autobiography remains the only full-length memoir by a black cowhand from the era. One passage in particular cuts deep, where Love notes that his exact birth date was never recorded, because in those days no account was kept of such trivial matters as the birth of a slave baby. Bass Reeves escaped slavery in 1838 and fled to Indian Territory during the Civil War. And by 1875, he'd become one of the first black deputy U.S., a marshals operating west of the Mississippi. 32 years in that role produced approximately 3,000 arrests and 14 dead outlaws, and Reeves himself never took a wound. Standing 6'2", ambidextrous and illiterate, he memorized every warrant he carried and used disguises to track fugitives. When his own son committed murder, Reeves arrested him personally. Historians widely cite him as a possible inspiration for the Lone Ranger. Bill Pickett, of African American and Cherokee descent, invented bulldogging, which is steer wrestling, after watching hearing dogs bite steers' upper lips to control them. The National Rodeo Hall of Fame eventually inducted him as its first African American member, though rodeos frequently barred him from competing during his actual career on account of his race. Bose Icard, a black cowboy, but rode as Charles Goodnight's right-hand man for years along the Goodnight-Loving Trail. When Icard died, Goodnight paid for the gravestone himself and inscribed it with words that may stand as the finest tribute one man ever wrote for another. Served with me 4 years on the Goodnight-Loving Trail, he surpassed any man I had in endurance and faithfulness. The gun myth. Now for the myth that refuses to die. Hollywood cowboys fire a revolver roughly every 30 seconds, but real cowboys on the trail mostly went unarmed. Granville Stewart, governor of Montana, estimated that not more than 10 out of 100 cowboys owned a revolver during the 1880s in Wyoming and Montana, though most carried a rifle for predators and hunting. The cowboy's actual primary tool was the lariat, not a six-shooter. Charles Goodnight observed that the average cowboy couldn't shoot well with a pistol, and that the best marksmen were professional gunslingers, lawmen, and gamblers, none of whom spent their days hearing cattle. And here's the part that really upends the mythology. Cattle towns enforced strict gun control. Dodge City, Tombstone, Abilene, and Wichita all banned firearms within city limits. And visitors checked their weapons with law enforcement at the edge of town, almost exactly like a modern coat check. The gunfight at the OK Corral started because of Tombstone's weapons ban. The XYT Ranch in Texas, stretching across 3 million acres, fired any cowboy caught carrying a gun on the property. 45 total homicides occurred between 1870 and 1885 across all 5 of Kansas's major cattle towns. According to historian Robert Dykstra, that averages out to 0.6 murders per town per year, which means the Wild West was by the numbers surprisingly tame. The cattle barons and the death of the open range. While cowboys pulled in $30 a month sleeping in mud, a handful of men built empires off the same cattle. Richard King founded his ranch in 1853 by purchasing 1,500 acres for $300, and by the time he died in 1885, he owned over 500,000 acres as the richest man in Texas. Today, that ranch covers 825,000 acres, making it larger than Rhode Island. John Chisholm, known as the Cattle King of the Pacos, controlled range stretching over 100 millimeters along the Pecos River in New Mexico and ran 60,000 to 100,000 head. Goodnight's J.A. Ranch in Paladuro Canyon grew to 1.325 million acres, holding 100,000 cattle of $45 million in British and Scottish money flooded into American cattle during the 1880s, drawn by reports promising 33% annual returns. Wyoming alone saw 181 livestock companies incorporate between 1880 and 1900, carrying over $94 million in combined capitalization. Nearly all of them were about to lose everything. 5 forces destroyed the open range. Joseph Glidden's barbed wire patent on November the 24th, 1874, launched an industry producing over 80 million pounds of fencing annually by 1880, and the wire carved up open land faster than anyone anticipated. Cowboys fought back violently in Texas during the 1880s, with armed bands of fence cutters tearing down wire across more than half the state's counties, and racking up an estimated $20 million in damage was until the governor called a special legislative session in January 1884 to make the crime a felony. Railroads reached Texas in the early 1880s, eliminating the need for overland drives entirely. Homesteaders fenced water sources and pushed quarantine laws. And years of over-grazing wore the range and down to dirt. And then, the winter of 1886 to 1887 finished the job in what became known as the Great Deup. A scorching drought through the summer of 1886 left cattle weak and ranges bare, and early blizzards rolled in by November. January 9th, 1887, brought a storm that dumped over 16 inches of snow across the Great Plains, while temperatures plunged to 43 degrees in Bismarck and a reported 63 at some Montana ranches. But rain fell on top of the snow and froze into a solid ice sheet that locked away whatever grass remained. Cattle mortality on the northern ranges approached 90%. Montana alone lost an estimated 362,000 head. Theodore Roosevelt, whose ranches near Medora lay in ruins, wrote 5 words that captured the whole catastrophe. "We have had a perfect smash-up all through the cattle country." The cattle industry lost more than animals that winter. It lost an entire way of doing business. The last recorded drives on the Western Trail trickled through in 1893 and 1894. And by 1895, the era had ended for good after the trail. When the open range closed, cowboys scattered in every direction. Some settled into ranch work, mending fences and growing hay, instead of driving cattle across open country. Others joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, which amounts to the 1890s version of landing a reality TV gig once your actual career falls apart. A few turned to law enforcement while others went the opposite direction. Nat Love took a job as a Pullman porter on the railroads, and Teddy Blue Abbott married and settled down to ranch life. Longhorns gave way to Herefords and Holstein on smaller fenced operations, and the cowboy became a ranch hand, while the myth grew larger than the reality had ever been. E.C. Teddy Blue Abbott left behind what might be the most honest assessment of cowboy life ever recorded. "Cowboys," he wrote, "but were mostly medium-sized men, as a heavy man was hard on horses, quick and wiry, and as a rule, very good-natured. In fact, it did not pay to be anything else. The only 2 things an old-time cowpuncher truly feared, according to Abbott, were a decent woman and being set afoot. And he took issue with how other old-timers recounted the past, noting that they told about stampedes and hardships, but they never put in any of the fun, and fun was at least half of it. That might be the most cowboy sentence anyone ever committed to paper. Your life was brutal, dangerous, underpaid, and short, built around beans at every meal, sleeping on bare ground, pulling your own teeth, crossing rivers you couldn't swim, and riding headlong into stampedes in total darkness. And yet somehow, it was apparently also fun, at least half the time. An estimated 35,000 cowboys drove roughly 10 million cattle north from Texas between 1866 and 1886. Most were teenagers and young men whose bodies gave out after 5 to 7 years of trail work. About a quarter of them were black. Another 15 to 20% were Hispanic, and they collectively built the myth that defines how America pictures itself, only to watch Hollywood erase most of them from the story. 20 years. That's all the golden age of the cowboy lasted, from the first post-war drives to the Great Job. 20 years of beans, dust, drowning, stampedes, and $30 a month that somehow became the most romanticized chapter in American history. Teddy Blue was probably right, though. It does sound kind of fun. If you liked this video, go ahead and hit subscribe. If you didn't, well, and as the cowboys used to say, everything discouraging.